Welcome. Today we're going to go over the late 18th and 19th centuries, so the late 1700s to 1800s, in case you don't know how centuries work, because year zero is, of course, the first century. It counts. We're started here with we got the modern age, which is, of course, launched by multiple revolutions: the industrial, the American, the French. We have the development of the Enlightenment. This is the age of reason, where rational and scientific approach to beliefs takes root. In art, we have what's called stylistic pluralism, which means that there's many styles, and a lot of them are in reaction to each other, and in competition with each other. The traditional sources of patronage have changed and withered, and so there's a new sort of approach to making art, how to be an artist, how to sell work to make a living as an artist. The first term we have in this time period is neoclassicism, which, as you may imagine, is an emulation of classical Greek and Roman art. So neo-classic, new classic. It's an effort to represent non-hereditary government, so not kings, not queens, and pro-republic. It's a marked removal away from Rococo, the sort of frivolousness of that and the forms and the content that it has. And it's a return to classical simplicity and order. Here is the main example of neoclassical art, which is David's The Oath of the Horatii. This is a story of virtue and a readiness to die for liberty. So this man is asking him, are you ready? And they pledge their allegiance, right, to this. It has this really classical sculptural effect, right? The men are strong and ready. They're all together. Like they actually, it's hard to imagine how they fit in this space. So they're all three as one. And then the women are overcome with emotion and unable to participate, which is, of course, a incorrect and negative view of women at the time for some people. Women were banned from the art academy classes where the unclothed models would be drawn. How you learn how to be a neoclassical artist. Of course, you have the arches, right? The Roman type arches. You have the three of them making the Trinity, and this focal point created by all these eyes looking here near the center of the picture. Now, what's nice is, of course, women were able to overcome some obstacles. This is one. Angelica Kauffman. And here she shows, of course, a different vision of women's abilities in comparison to the prior painting, where she's, a woman in classical times is practicing what she can. So she's not allowed to look at nude models for some silly societal reason. Can look at the sculptures that exist there. Another example of neoclassical art. This is his version. Ang is how you pronounce his last name. His version of classicism. This is Oedipus and the Sphinx. So the story of that depicted here. What I really like is you have the dead skull down, of course, dead skeleton, but you also have the foot right here, a dead person that didn't answer the Sphinx's questions correctly. But yeah, you can tell it's classical for the reasons that we've gone over in terms of classical art. And we also have a return to classical, this neoclassical effect in architecture. So this is Thomas Jefferson's Monticello. It's often called a federal style, and you see it in the White House, etc. So as a kind of reaction to this neoclassic art, we have Romanticism, and so it agrees with the importance of the individual liberty that neoclassic art has, but it's more noted by its emotional expression, whereas the other ones were much more about ideals and order and that sort of thing. Romanticism is denoted by its emotional response. Imagination and emotion are more valuable than reason. It has some ideas about nature being less corrupt than civilization. And especially early on, it has this general preoccupation with current events and things that are going on at the time that are important to people there and at that moment. This is Francisco Goya, the 3rd of May, related to Napoleon's occupation. And I believe he experienced some of the horrors that come within that, Napoleon's occupations and the deaths and the murders from war and occupation. So here we depict, the firing squad, right, who are faceless, because they're not turned towards us. And then the people that are, the emotional targets are ragged, and we can see their faces, we can see their emotion. They're actually highlighted with the light. And of course, this is a protest against the sort of tyrannical governments. The Wrath of Jericho. The Wrath of Medusa by Jericho. And this was also something about, in France, something that happened. A ship crashed where 147 people made a makeshift raft after the ship started to sink. And then all but 15 died after 13 days from their rescue. The ones that survived resorted to cannibalism, starved. And then the event became an international scandal, in part because the French captain was viewed as incompetent. So yeah, very much related to current events. Kind of an English version here by Turner, The Burning of the House of Lords and Commons. It's the brushwork is totally different, right? Very fast, very loose. It could almost be called like impressionism, right? The flames are really high. There's no way they were this high, and he's kind of bent the river to make his point across. So yeah, emotional. You can see the difference, right? The feeling rather than the actual geography. And that sort of feeling and geography kind of transferred to the romantic ideas of America, the landscape painters of America at that time. This romanticism in the untamed landscape, right? And landscape painting, it's always been really about like things that are really close and things that are really far that give you this really great expanse to look through. It's Thomas Cole. This is Duncanson. Beautiful painting, right? You'll notice, again, we have small people showing us the sort of immensity, the just vastness of nature. And in some ways, these people look almost incredibly small, like miniaturized. Compare them to the flowers or the size of these trees back here, or even these trunks coming out of the water. They are incredibly small, and that's to get that romantic point across. This is to show that not all romantic art was about actual current events. Eugene Delacroix, The Death of Sardanapalus. And so this is different in that it depicts a literary scene, in particular a play by Lord Byron. So in this scenario, the invaders are at the gate, he's going to lose, so he takes poison and he orders his favorite possessions destroyed right before him. You'll notice we have this very Baroque composition and these sort of very emotional gestures of humans, these very loose strokes, and then just this oriental sort of extravagant horror where all these goods are being brought in, murdering these women, these horses, this favorite horse to be murdered. It's quite emotional, so quite romantic. It's the same artist that we saw with the Sphinx. And just to show that, it's silly to think of romanticism and neoclassical as separate things, that you only did one or the other. Plenty of artists did both, and so could both be thought of in both, as Delacroix could. And these guys were actually like great competitors with each other. I don't know if they particularly liked each other. So he definitely had that line between neoclassical and romanticism. This is, of course, an exotic scene, right? These sort of Eastern motifs. You have a hookah here, and then this impossible form of this woman. You'll notice her back is way too long. Her left arm is much shorter than her right, or this one is much longer, if you want to think of it that way. And this sort of strange ability to put this other foot like this, and you can see this line of the thigh going this way, like it would be all the way up here if we were to continue that on. So it's made raw. It was shocking at the time. They made fun of how raw it was, but it's still like it's an amazing piece. You could and he did this all on purpose. Like it looks good now. It's a famous piece of art, smarter than the critics in some ways, but very much like male dominated, right? Like this woman is here for male viewing and male pleasure. The idea that he just smoked and now just admiring the view. During this time, of course, we have the development of photography. By this time, 1871, it's pretty well mastered, but just to show you some examples of photography. And then as a segue into what's the next sort of era of this period in terms of realism. So portraiture, of course, big deal. Landscape, big deal. And then this affects art. We have this idea of academic art. These art forms that we had, Romanticism, Neoclassical, they become mainstream and they're taught. It's what's expected. Tradition-minded works follow formulas. They're laid down either by an academy or a school. And then we have this thing called the French Academy Salon. This is an annual exhibition in the 19th century, and it's the only way an artist might become known in those days. If you didn't get in, you might not make it as an artist. Some other artists, they got in, but then sometimes they were out, and so they would have to set up their own shows, and that's when we get into the other pieces, the other isms of this time period. We have this idea of realism as a style. It's a style depicting the ordinary without idealism, without being exotic, and without having any nostalgia. It's a reaction to both neoclassicism and romanticism, and it's, of course, influenced by photography and what photography can do, but also what photography can't do, right? So it's not photography, but it is definitely influenced by it. Very much look at this. One of the greatest examples and one of my famous artists from this time is Courbet in realism. It's called The Stonebreakers. Made in 1849, but destroyed during World War II, so no longer exists. And these are ordinary road workers, right? It's not glamorous. What they're doing is they're breaking rocks to prepare the space for a road. And it's back-breaking, monotonous work. This guy is way too old. This guy is way too young to be doing this. But just showing that as it is. Painting it kind of craggly, like these humans are just as craggly and detailed as these rocks. Great stuff. We also have more popular versions of realism. This is Rosa Bonheur, who was a woman, and the thought is that this is her dressed as a man, because, again, it's hard to be a woman artist and have yourself in here. The expectations of women. And here's a great example of what would be considered this idea of either neoclassical, sort of views, and then what becomes realism. So this guy right here taught this guy. So this guy worked under this guy. And here's they're two separate visions of a similar thing. Here the statue becomes actually a human form and kisses him. You have this Cupid over here, these allegorical paintings in the back, and these classical sort of proportions and figures, right? The ideal here. Here we have the guy actually working hard on this thing, and it's not magical. It doesn't turn into an actual human, but then here's the model, the kind of what they back in the day thought as kind of lumpy looking model. And the reality of, having your clothes just kind of cast on the side. A woman here to help make sure nothing scandalous happens, right? The loose brushwork here in the back. So this is realism. This is the reaction against this stuff to show you what the difference is. We also have in Harlem, we have this sort of African-American realism. It's a great piece by Tanner. Best known African-American painter before the 20th century. He studied with this Akins on the right here. And just great painting, right? Dignified portrayal of blacks in avoiding sentimentality, but also just exhibiting how life is, how simple the space is, but practicing music and how, it can take you away from that stuff. Edward Manet, so Manet, Manet, not Monet yet. Luncheon on the Grass. So we have this female nude with clothed males and no allegorical context. So that's shocking for the time. And typically, art from this period on, and even before with Courbet, shocking kind of holds its own, right? The stuff that was considered shocking or ridiculous back then is the stuff we still talk about now in this class and in others. It combines, of course, a flattened painting in the Japanese style, because we have this really unshadowed woman, and that was one thing the Academy made fun of. They don't care if she's actually nude; they're just surprised that it's not. It doesn't have good shading. So the idea is maybe that's from Japanese prints. Makes me also think, this was before flash photography, but maybe even flash photography has that sort of illusion. But yeah, mocked by the Academy, but still looking real. And this is probably how for two men and two women might spend the day. It might go for a swim at the pond on a picnic. So it could be considered realism also. We move into this term you of course know as Impressionism. This is a group that formed after their denial to the Salon, and so in this case they organized their own exhibition. A lot of them were denied access because it was so different. The term comes from this impression of what the eye actually sees rather than what the mind interprets. So not thinking about your mind interpreting and changing, but just what your eyes see immediately and then making that mark. Here's Monet, so with an O, who you may know of more, as an example, right? Just playing with the way the light, you'll see the brushwork is very fast, very loose. There's no details on the people, just these kind of like fast forms, loose brushwork, saturated color, putting it down, letting it live, and going at it. Dun, dun. Here we go. Some more Monet. It's a smaller painting, 19 by 25 inches. And the term Impressionism is thought to have arisen from this actual title. So Impression Sunrise, 1872. And the term was given by a critic. It was originally meant to be derogatory, but the artist took it on as like, yeah, that's exactly what we do. We give this impression of what we see. Here are small dabs of color, right? Fit close together, but then they blend together. Your eyes naturally blend together and doesn't search for actually more detail. So it's kind of a great development. Like these brush marks alone might look kind of silly and naive, but together they work, and in their location to each other, they actually work out really well. They use a lot of pure color, so directly out of the tube. This is when technology allows tubes to be developed, so you can take paint outside, you can apply color directly, and they're optimistic about the direction towards technology. They're not against it. A Renoir painting, right? So just so you, like, there's a lot of different methods of Impressionism. There's not just one method. This one, of course, has more detail. It's still very soft. And there's a lot of scenes of contemporary middle-class people just enjoying the outdoors and leisure activities with each other. There's this interest in human drama. And then I like this piece, too, because it's the way that it's shadowed, like it's under shade of trees, right? So nature's kind of implied, for me, by the shadow and the light. There's a few trees back here, but this whole space feels like the trees are just out of our sight and just above us. Gives a great view. We have Edgar Degas, who is not, you wouldn't really call him an Impressionist painter. He was working separately from them, influenced by similar things, in some ways similar, in some ways not. And in here you can see the obvious influence of the asymmetry of Japanese prints, right? We talked about these before, like this kind of this asymmetrical vibe going on, this bottom half, like how these figures work to create this sort of line that separates them from them. And yeah, very spontaneous, obviously influenced by photographs too, just capturing moments, but also kind of funny, like how it shows this unglamorous reality of ballet class. You have, mom or grandma reading a newspaper, this guy's, leaning up against her, just kind of bored, waiting for the class to end. It's really fun, nice stuff. Mary Cassatt, who we've talked about a little bit in the past, about being influenced by prints. And yeah, you can see, absolutely, influenced by prints, by interesting compositions that are not normal. These large areas of semi-flat color. She's great. Another example of hers. And just, yeah, everyday life, right? A lot of mothers with their children is a lot of her work. These nice, simple moments together. And, we're focusing on painting. In reality, like, Western art is heavily dominated by looking at paintings. Of course, there's all kinds of things going on in sculpture. Here we have Rodin's The Thinker, which I'm sure you're aware of. He actually used Michelangelo's unfinished pieces, the one we saw still coming out of the marble, as inspiration for his actual work, for these rough finishes. And then we move on to post-impressionism. So after impressionism, it's not a single style. It's not exactly impressionism. It's a lot of different things, actually. And so this one by Seurat, which is in Chicago, is the important thing about this, it's an everyday scene of middle class families at the lake, but this is important in terms of its what's called pointillism, and pointillism is using these little dots of color to when you look at them from afar, they blend together to be various different colors. So it's kind of a big thing and interesting approach to technology and how your consciousness and your eyes actually work. Of course, predating like how TVs work with just RGB dots to make all the colors you see, printing presses to mix to make all the images you see in a book, etc. Cézanne, right, gives this impression of air and depth through color use. So this atmospheric perspective of the blue, right, this darker area here that pops out in front of us, and these geometric sort of planes, but with the brush marks. So making squares and angles and lines, right? It's hard not to see it. In fact, of course it is. It's like a precursor to Cubism. As his work gets more and more towards that direction. You have a sort of rhythm developing because of the direction that he's painting. Another post-impressionist work I'm sure you've heard of. Van Gogh, I assume you know him, right? And so more expressionist, we would think. Highly textural brushwork, very textural brushwork. You can see, even from here, this image, this digital image from far away on a small painting, you can see the actual brushwork, how he painted it with what brushes, if you paid attention to that stuff. Uses strong color to express emotions clearly, and again, of course, influenced by Japanese colors, the flat colors, the direct flat colors, the composition that makes it asymmetrical. Everything's over here, empty space over here, except a little building in the back. Starry Night, right? Color as emotion is something to remember for his work, right? It's not about an accuracy and a retelling of what your mind's thinking about it. It's color, using color as expression to give the feeling he saw whenever he saw these things. It's got some powerful symbolism, these tremendous forces that undulate and vibrate in the sky. And then this is the church's spire kind of echoes what's supposed to be a cypress tree, which I never knew what that was. Like, it was always strange when I saw that as a kid. This sort of form just arising out of the front. And again, small scale of human life just shows us the vastness of the powers outside of that. Paul Gauguin, more the same, right? Like, these are all different, but you can see that they have the same interest, right? They have the same, this tree in this angle, almost similar to this. Flat colors, right? And so he was critical of materialism of the industrial society. He worked as a stockbroker for years and then stopped to become a painter. And this one is depicting a peasant's vision of Jacob wrestling an angel. Bright colors, again, flat colors, if you remember. What is that doing? It's expressing emotion, or maybe even creating like a unreal scene, right? By not having a natural space. He's making that, allowing it to be an unreal space. He also went to Tahiti at the age of 43, left his family, like a real jerk, left his family, his wife, his kids, to go to Tahiti and just attempt to break away from society and, be with a bunch of naked women, I assume. But dealing with this idea of dreams, this color is not real, right? Of course, and all these shapes are just kind of abstract shapes, and you can see how we slowly build up towards abstraction, and the reasons towards that. Also, this love of non-Western society, and what goes on there, what kind of images they make, what kind of images they produce themselves, shows that interest. Toulouse-Lautrec at the Moulin Rouge. I've gone over this a lot, right? Unusual angles, cropping, strange colors, right? We can see this progression in art and humans, how we go from one to the next. Strange compositions related to Asian art, strange colors related to flat colors and colors that maybe are more expressive. And then finally we get into symbolism, which developed around 1885. We have decorative forms and symbols that were intentionally vague or open-ended. And then the one you probably know the most is Scream, right? So this it's really to use symbolism to express intensity, right? This emotion, like this figure caught in isolation and fear and like crying out. A great example of symbolism and just how different that is from the things we've seen prior. There was also, this would be considered symbolism too, the death of the gravedigger. So it doesn't have to be painted like this, but it is using symbolism, right? It is rallying against realism. It wants to focus on the importance of the idea of spirit, of what exists outside of reality. So this could almost be like a Game of Thrones sort of image, right? This this angel of death stealing this guy's soul so it turns green. It's kind of amazing to think that was made in 1895 as a symbolist work. And then finally, we just architecture-wise, we haven't talked about much, but Art Nouveau, of course, develops at this time. And so this is a new art in architecture. It's really about bringing in natural forms into architecture. And when you see it, you've seen Art Nouveau, but it also does stuff like this in Barcelona. Yeah, these undulated forms that mirror natural forms with the new techniques, whether it's steel or concrete, and the way that they can reinforce that. Thank you.